The banner over the door read, Fairview High, Class of 1966, 40 years and counting, though someone had crossed out the 0 and written a shaky 5 above it in marker. Diane stood under it for a moment longer than she needed to, smoothing the front of her blue dress, telling herself this was just an evening out. "You look lovely," Walter said, offering his arm the way he'd done for 34 years. "Though I still don't understand why we couldn't just stay home and watch the game." "Because Carla would never let me hear the end of it," Diane said, and took his arm anyway. Inside, the hall smelled like it always had, floor wax and old paper, with the lake drifting in through propped open doors. Round tables wore plastic cloths the color of the old school colors. A slideshow of yearbook photos looped on a screen no one was watching. Walter lasted an hour. He blamed his head, the noise, the fluorescent lights doing something behind his eyes. Diane kissed his cheek at the door and told him to take the car. She'd get a ride. She wanted to stay a little longer. She meant it. She also didn't examine too closely why she meant it. She was standing near the punch table, half listening to Carla recount a hip replacement in more detail than anyone had asked for, when the band, 3 men in their 60s who'd clearly been rehearsing in someone's garage, eased into the opening bars of a song Diane hadn't heard in 40 years. Her stomach dropped before her mind caught up to why. "Save the last dance for me." She turned toward the sound without meaning to, the way you turn toward a name someone calls across a parking lot, uncertain if it's really yours. And there he was, older, heavier through the shoulders, silver where there used to be dark brown. But the eyes hadn't changed. Robbie Hale stood near the band, hands in his pockets, head tilted at an angle she remembered from 100 hallway conversations. He hadn't seen her yet. "It's just a song," she told herself. "It's just a man you knew a long time ago." But her hands had gone cold around her punch cup, and that told her something her mind wasn't ready to admit. "Diane?" Carla was saying something. Diane hadn't heard a word of it. "Sorry. What?" "I said, isn't that Robbie Hale? I heard he moved back after his wife passed. Terrible thing. Cancer, I think." The room seemed to narrow to the space between them. He turned, scanning the crowd the way people do at these things, half hoping and half dreading recognition. And then he found her. Diane watched something shift in his face. Surprise first, then something softer, something that made her chest tighten in a way she hadn't felt in longer than she wanted to count. He started walking toward her. "Don't," she thought, though she wasn't sure if she meant him or herself. "Don't make this into something." "Diane," he said, stopping close enough that she could see the small scar above his eyebrow, the one from falling off his bike the summer they turned 16. His voice had gone rougher with age, but it still did the same thing to her it always had. "I wasn't sure you'd be here. Carla dragged me," she said, and was relieved her voice came out steady. "I almost didn't come." "I'm glad you did." 3 words. Nothing more than politeness required. But something in the way he said them settled low in her chest, familiar as an old ache in a joint that only flares on cold days. He held out his hand. Not for a handshake, she realized a half-second too late, but open, palm up, the way he used to when he wanted her to dance. "For old times," he said, nodding toward the band. "One song, if you'll allow an old man his nostalgia." Diane looked at his hand. She thought of Walter, home already, probably asleep in his chair with the television on. She thought of 34 steady, good years. She thought of a version of herself, 17 years old, who used to believe this exact song was written for the two of them. "Diane?" The band kept playing. Somewhere behind her, Carla had gone quiet, watching. Diane set down her punch cup and reached for his hand. His hand was warm and larger than she remembered, though maybe it was only that her own had grown smaller with age. They didn't so much dance as sway, the way people do now when the songs from their youth ask more of the body than it has left to give. Neither of them spoke for the first verse. "You still smell like gardenias," Robbie said finally, low enough that only she could hear it. "You still notice things you shouldn't," Diane said, though there was no sting in it. He laughed, that same laugh, unchanged, the one thing 40 years hadn't touched. "Some habits don't break." The song ended too soon, and not soon enough. When the band slid into something faster, something that belonged to a different decade entirely, Robbie stepped back and inclined his head toward the doors. "Walk with me? It's stuffy in here, and I imagine we have some catching up that doesn't fit into 3 minutes and a chorus." She should have said no. She thought the word, even shaped it in her mind. What came out instead was, "Let me tell Carla I'm stepping out." They ended up by the water, where the hall's lights spilled yellow across the first few feet of the lake before the dark took over. It was quiet enough to hear the small sounds: insects, water lapping at the dock pylons, their own footsteps on the gravel path. "I wrote to you," Robbie said, without preamble, staring out at the water rather than at her. "After we moved, every week, for almost 2 months. Diane stopped walking. "I never got anything." "I know that now." He turned to face her. "My mother found out my father had already accepted a transfer to a different city than the one I gave you. Some mix-up with his company, changed twice in 6 weeks. By the time I had an address that would actually reach me, I'd stopped hearing back from you and figured you'd moved on. I was 17. I didn't have the sense to keep trying." "I waited for a letter that never came," Diane said quietly. "I checked that mailbox every day for a year. I thought—" She stopped herself. "What did you think? I thought you found something better and didn't want to say so." The old hurt came up faster than she expected, sharp as if no time had passed at all. "I built a whole story around it, told myself it was for the best. It wasn't true. None of it." His voice had an edge of urgency now, like a man setting down a weight he'd carried a long time. "I thought about you for years, Diane. Even after I married. Even after I told myself I shouldn't." She didn't answer right away. The water moved, small and dark, against the dock posts. "I have a husband," she said finally. Not sharp, just true. A fact laid on the table between them. "I know." Robbie nodded, and something in his face closed gently, like a door pulled to, but not latched. "I'm not trying to undo anything, Diane. I wanted you to know it wasn't what you thought. That's all." "That's all," she repeated, and wasn't sure if she believed him or herself, or the strange lightness in her chest that had no business being there. They stood a moment longer in the quiet. Then Robbie cleared his throat, and when he spoke again, his voice had eased back into something careful, almost formal. "I'm only in town another few days. Settling my mother's old house mostly. Paperwork, nothing interesting." He hesitated. "There's a walking path around the lake. I used to think about it sometimes. Wondered if it still looked the same. Would you want to see it with me? Tomorrow, maybe. Just to talk. Nothing more than that." The offer hung there, plain and small and enormous all at once. Diane thought of Walter's porch light he kept meaning to fix, of the 2 mugs by the coffee maker every morning, of a life built slow and careful over 3 decades. She also thought of a mailbox she used to check every day, and a letter that never came, and the particular ache of finding out the story she'd told herself for 40 years wasn't true. "I don't know, Robbie," she said, and it was the most honest thing she'd said all night. He nodded, unhurried, the way he always used to give her room to think. "Well, I'll be at the path by the old boathouse at 2 if you change your mind." He didn't press further. He just looked at her a moment longer than politeness required, said goodnight, and walked back toward the lights of the hall, leaving Diane alone by the water, with a decision she hadn't made yet, and a whole night ahead of her to not make it. Diane told herself all morning she wasn't going. She told Walter this while he worked the crossword. She told the bathroom mirror while she brushed out her hair. She told the closet while she stood in front of it for 10 minutes before pulling out a pair of walking shoes and a cardigan the color of the lake in autumn. At 1:45, she was in the car. She parked near the old boathouse, its paint gone gray and peeling, and found him already there, sitting on the low stone wall, the way he used to when they were teenagers waiting for the school bus. He stood when he saw her, and something in his face, relief maybe, or just plain gladness, made her wish, for one unguarded second, that she hadn't come after all. "You came," he said. "I told myself I was just going for a walk." "Then let's walk." The path circled the lake through a stand of birch trees just starting to turn. They talked about ordinary things at first. Her sister's grandchildren, his years running a hardware store 2 states away, the particular ache of watching your parents' generation disappear, one funeral at a time. It was easy. Too easy. The kind of ease that comes from a conversation picking up exactly where it left off. 40 years being nothing at all. They stopped at a bench overlooking the water. The same bench, Robbie said, where he'd once tried and failed 3 times to work up the nerve to hold her hand. "Did you ever manage it?" Diane asked, though she remembered perfectly well. "Eventually." He smiled, looking out at the water instead of at her. "Took me the whole summer." They sat. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It had weight to it. The particular silence of 2 people both aware of a current running under the surface of things, and both too careful, so far, to name it. His hand rested on the bench between them. Hers rested near it. Neither moved for a long moment. Then, slowly, his fingers found hers. She should have pulled away. She thought about pulling away. Instead, she sat very still, watching the small, ordinary miracle of their hands together, feeling something in her chest crack open that she'd kept carefully shut for 4 decades. "Diane." His voice had gone quiet. She looked up. He was closer than she'd realized, close enough that she could see the flecks of gray in eyes still exactly the color she remembered, close enough to feel the question in the air before he asked it. "Tell me to stop," he said. "If you want me to stop, tell me now." She didn't tell him to stop. His hand came up, slow, giving her every chance to turn away, and rested against the side of her face. She felt her own breath catch, felt 40 years fall away, like something she'd only been carrying out of habit. Then he leaned in, and she met him halfway, and for one suspended moment, there was nothing else. Not Walter, not the porch light, not 34 years of an ordinary good life, just the lake and the birch leaves. Turning overhead, and a kiss that felt like closing a circle she hadn't known was still open. It lasted only a few seconds. When it ended, Diane pulled back so fast she nearly lost her balance on the bench. Her hand flew to her mouth, as if she could take it back that way. "Diane, I have to go." Her voice came out thin, unsteady, nothing like her own. "Diane, wait!" But she was already standing, already walking, faster and faster along the path back toward the boathouse, her heart pounding with something that felt like panic and grief and a terrible, guilty joy, all tangled together into one unbearable knot. She didn't look back. She didn't trust herself to. Behind her, Robbie called her name once more, and then didn't call it again. The drive home passed in pieces. A red light, she nearly ran, her own hands on the wheel looking unfamiliar, the radio playing something she turned off without deciding to. By the time she pulled into the driveway, she'd stopped crying, but only because she'd run out of whatever it was that had been coming up in her. Walter was on the porch, kneeling by the light fixture with a screwdriver, the same broken porch light he'd been meaning to fix since spring. "There you are," he said, not looking up. "I was starting to think you'd run off and joined the circus." "Just a long walk," Diane said, and was surprised her voice held. "Well, good. You look like you got some sun." He squinted up at her, then back at the fixture. "This wiring's older than we are. I don't know why I keep thinking I can fix it instead of just calling someone." "You always think you can fix things yourself first," Diane said. "It's very you." "Is that a compliment?" "It's just true." She stood on the step and watched him work, his glasses sliding down his nose, his tongue between his teeth, the way it always did when he concentrated, humming some tune he didn't know he was humming, off-key in the same 3 notes he'd been off-key on for 30 years. It was such a small, unremarkable thing. She'd watched him do 1,000 small, unremarkable things across 3 decades, and never once had it undone her the way it did now. She went inside before he could see her face. That evening she moved through the house doing ordinary tasks, dishes, folding towels, watering the fern in the hallway that never seemed to either thrive or die. And underneath every motion ran the same current, the bench by the lake, his hand finding hers, the few seconds that had cracked something open she didn't know how to close again. It didn't mean anything, she told herself, wringing out a dish rag with more force than it required. It meant everything, said some other, quieter voice, the one she trusted less and believed more. The phone rang at 8, while Walter was in his chair with the news on low. Diane saw the area code before she answered. Not local, a number she didn't recognize, but somehow knew. She let it ring twice before picking up, stepping into the kitchen, keeping her voice low. "Diane." Robbie, sounding uncertain in a way she'd never heard from him, not even at 17. "I shouldn't have called. I know that. I leave Thursday, and I couldn't leave things the way we left them." She glanced toward the living room, where the blue light of the television flickered against the wall, where Walter's familiar off-key humming had resumed without him noticing. "Robbie, I'm not asking you to leave anything," he said quickly. "I'm not asking for anything, Diane, I promise you that. I just want to see you once more before I go. To say a proper goodbye this time. Not like before." She closed her eyes. She could feel the whole weight of her life balanced somewhere behind her sternum. 34 years on one side, one afternoon by a lake on the other, and no honest way yet to say which side was heavier. "I need to think," she said. "That's fair." A pause. "I'll be at the house until Thursday morning. You know where to find me, if you want to." He didn't push further. He never had. That had always been the strange, unfair thing about him, that he made space instead of taking it, which made it so much harder to walk away. Diane hung up the phone and stood alone in the kitchen for a long moment, listening to the small domestic sounds of the house around her. The refrigerator humming, Walter's voice calling something about the weather forecast, the tick of the clock her mother had given them as a wedding gift, 34 Decembers ago. She had until Thursday to decide who she was going to be. Thursday came the way difficult days always do, too slowly in the waiting, too quickly once it arrived. Diane spent Wednesday night unable to sleep, lying beside Walter's steady breathing, running the two paths over and over until they blurred into something she could no longer tell apart from grief. She thought of 17-year-old Diane, who had loved a boy with her whole unguarded heart and lost him to a lost letter and a mother's mistake. She thought of that girl's hurt, still living somewhere inside her, still wanting, after 40 years, to be told it hadn't been for nothing. But she thought too of a night 3 decades ago, when Walter had sat up with her until 4 in the morning after her father's funeral, saying nothing useful, just staying. She thought of the small, unglamorous architecture of a whole life built together. Arguments won and let go. A garden they'd both nearly killed twice. 2 mugs by the coffee maker every single morning without fail. Robbie had been a door that closed too early. And grief has a way of turning a closed door into something more beautiful than it might have been, had it simply been allowed to stay open. She drove to the old house on the edge of town Thursday morning, not sure until she was halfway there whether she meant to say goodbye or something else entirely. Robbie was loading the last of the boxes into his car when she pulled up, and he straightened at the sound of her tires on the gravel, something hopeful and careful crossing his face all at once. "You came," he said again, the same words as the boathouse, but different now. "I came to say goodbye," Diane said, the right way this time. Something in his shoulders eased, and something else in them settled into a quiet, accepting sadness. "I thought about what you offered me," she went on, choosing the words slowly, the way you carry something breakable across a room. "And I think some part of me will always wonder. I think that's just true, and I don't think there's any use pretending otherwise." "But," Robbie said, not a question, just meeting her halfway. "But I built something real, Robbie. 34 years of it. It isn't the story I imagined at 17, but it's mine, and I chose it. And I don't want to become someone who walks out on it to chase the ghost of a summer that ended before it really had the chance to." He nodded slowly, and there were tears in his eyes he didn't bother hiding, which told her more than anything he'd said all week. "For what it's worth," he said, "I'm glad it was you. That night at the reunion. Whatever else. I'm glad I got to see you again, and to finally tell you the truth about the letters." "I'm glad too," Diane said, and found she meant it without reservation, the ache and the gladness sitting together now, instead of tearing at each other. "Take care of yourself, Robbie." "You too, Diane." She didn't hug him. A handshake felt wrong, too formal for what they'd been to each other. So in the end, she simply touched his arm, once, and turned back toward her car, before either of them could turn the moment into something it no longer needed to be. Driving home, she rolled the windows down and let the autumn air move through the car, and somewhere past the edge of town, she found herself, unexpectedly, humming, off-key, in 3 familiar notes, a tune she hadn't realized she'd learned so well after all these years. Walter was on the porch when she pulled in, the light fixture finally, triumphantly fixed, glowing steady against the coming dusk. "There you are," he said, looking up with the same unguarded smile he'd been giving her for 34 years. "I was starting to think you'd run off and joined the circus." Diane climbed the steps, sat down beside him on the old porch swing, and took his hand. Not out of habit this time, but on purpose, the way you choose, every day, the life you've built. "Just saying goodbye to an old ghost," she said. "I think I'm finally done with it." Walter squeezed her hand, not needing to understand it fully to understand that it mattered. "Good," he said simply, "because I'm not nearly done with you yet." And in the fading light, with the porch lamp glowing warm above them for the first time in months, Diane understood, at last, that some doors are meant to close, not because what was behind them wasn't real, but because what waited on the other side of 34 years was more real still.